Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 17 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. I'm your host, Joe Muccia, and I am honored to have with me today Josh Donohue. Josh Donohue. Josh is an adjunct professor of history at Farmingdale State College and the Suffolk Community College. I went to Nassau Community College for a little while. So these are schools on Long
Yes.
Island. For those of you that don't know, Josh is a Ranger fan. I won't hold that against him. I'm an Islander fan. I don't hold it against my dad either. He's a Ranger fan too. Sorry, little hockey in there for everybody. But Josh really piqued my interest when I was looking around, asking folks to see if they wanted to come on, and he pitched the idea of doing the Wake Island battle and I was really intrigued by that because I spend a lot of time looking at Western Europe. It's kind of the tentpole topic for the podcast, but I always like to go back to my roots, being a Marine, and talk Marine stuff. And so when Josh said, "Hey, we could do a show on Wake if you like," I was like, "Oh yeah, I like it, but I got to go back to study. I had to hit the books to catch up, which I've been doing for the last few days. So at least I can talk like I know what I'm doing here." But
Sure.
Josh, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. Big fan of you guys. Love the podcast. Not just the Pacific. I love, European theater. My grandfather and his brother were D-Day veterans. My great uncle was at Utah Beach. Grandfather was in Omaha. He was with one of the engineering units there and was part of the motor pool. So that's really where when I first heard that and was Saving Private Ryan had come out that summer '98. My dad said, "Your grandfather and your uncle were there." I'm like, "Wow!" And that just set me on a path down. And once, kind of fast forward, once I took military history when I was in grad school. That's really where Wake started to hit my radar because I did my thesis on the attack on Pearl Harbor, whether there was prior knowledge and things like sort of going through historiography and all these fancy terms they throw at you on the graduate level. But Wake just started; it just was always there. It was always a part of what I was looking at, reading. It was always a big part of the story of Pearl Harbor. It was basically an extension of it in many ways. But yeah, Wake. If you look behind me, the painting I have on the wall there, it's a painting called Cat and Mouse over Wake, painted by Mark Stewart. It's actually hand signed by four of the pilots of VMF-211, who were some of the brave pilots of the squadron that was defending the island, and they fought right down to the very last airplane. Not to get too far ahead, but this hangs on my wall. It's one of my most prized possessions, and I've also had a great opportunity to meet a lot of the family members who are all the Wake veterans are long gone now, and I think the last civilian just passed last year. So we don't have any living examples left, but we have plenty of stories. There's video. There's all sorts of accounts there. Wake for me took on a whole new meaning after I graduated. I said, I kind of want to write about this. And I just went on this path where I went to places like Boston University, where they have both Major Devereaux and Commander Cunningham's paper collections, which was very valuable to my research in the early going. And took a trip down to Washington, D.C., down to the Navy Yard, to the National Archives, the Marine Corps History Museum, the Marine Corps, the Gray Archives, the History Division. Everyone at Quantico just was so great to me and was so inviting and gave me everything I needed for my research. And I never give enough credit to them. They're amazing people along the way. But Wake just sort of became the thing I just latched onto and just bought books and research and documents and did more research remotely for the Eastern Carolina University has Paul Putnam's collection down there. He was the major who was the CEO of EMF 211, and again his stories, especially his POW journals, are quite remarkable.
Yeah, I latched on to what you said there early on in your preamble, and Wake kind of gets lost in the background as like almost like background noise to Pearl because it happens
Yeah.
literally right on the heels of it, and I don't think that most folks who pay attention to the Pacific War really don't think about it as a standalone battle and what happened there. It's kind of, obviously part of the broader campaign as it sits there north of the Marshall Islands.
Yeah.
It is, one of the Pacific bastions, and for folks that are not unfamiliar with it, I think we'll start to dive into it a little bit. There were only 449 Marines on the island, and there were a little over 1,500 civilian contractors, and I think about 40 Navy men total.
Yes, there were about, if my numbers are correct, there were about 12, close to I think 12 or 1,300 civilian contractors of the Contractors Pacific Naval Air Bases. They were in charge of Wake's infrastructure, road networks, buildings, the airfield, just some of the things that they're responsible for. They played a major role. There's no, just to put it out there, they don't get enough credit
Yeah, without a
for what
doubt.
they did. They were instrumental, and not to say all the civilians took part in aiding the Marines and the servicemen, but a good number of them did. Ammo loaders, right down to guys,
Yep.
delivering, grenades or whatever they needed. A lot of them did help out a lot.
Not
So,
only that, hardening
um,
structures, building
yeah.
defensive
So
positions,
there
really
were about
critical to the action.
Exactly. So there are about 68 naval personnel there and 6 Army personnel. The 6 Army men were actually in charge of Wake's radar.
Radar, yeah. Yep.
Not I should say radar. Excuse me. Their radio. Their radio. That's a big difference because Wake did
Oh,
not have a radar.
no,
It
it
was
didn't. It
actually
had
sitting on the dock at
what
Pearl
the heck
Harbor,
did
from
they
what I remember.
what the heck did they call them? Like directionals, something like that
Yeah,
that
it
they
was
used.
basically like a trailer that had, that was parked at the south end of the parking area, and they were the ones that picked up the distress call, the SOS, the Pearl Harbor was being attacked. This is no drill, and from that point on, from the time that they found out that Pearl was attacked, from the time that they were attacked, what was about 4 hours. It was about 11:58 a.m. on December 8th, actually, on the other side of the international date line. It was December 7th at Pearl. So a lot of dates get confused there. But what you said earlier was perfect. Wake doesn't get the attention. It
Yeah.
it just falls in the shadow of Pearl Harbor, of all the visuals, right? That's the thing too. You don't have any visuals really to speak of Wake Island, especially there really aren't any moving pictures of the battle or the buildup or anything like that. It's just all photographs that were taken before, during, and after the battle is what we have to go on, and accounts, obviously. So, what Wake did captivate the country for about 2 weeks in 1941. But after Wake fell to the Japanese and everything that happened after that, major battles in Europe and the Pacific were taking more priority over Wake. Wake was an afterthought at that point. You had obviously, the Doolittle raid in April of 42. You had Midway in June of 42. You had Guadalcanal in August of 42. So that pretty much put Wake well out of the public consciousness. But they
And
did
fairly
release a
quickly.
movie. They did release a movie in 1942 in September, which was hugely successful and actually was responsible for, again, raising money for war bond drives. As you'd walk out of the theater, there's the booth there waiting for you. And just a side note, how I found out about Wake Island in the first place, and I told Paul Woodage this, the movie Pulp Fiction, great Quentin Tarantino film. The watch scene where Christopher Walken is in the Air Force uniform talking to Bruce Willis's character as a kid. He mentions Wake Island in that scene, but in a sort of not in the proper context. He makes it sound like the garrison was wiped out and the Japanese killed every last person. Not true. In the movie Wake Island, they also have that as the ending, part of it, of the battle, that the Japanese come in and just, the commanders on the phone tell them to come in and get us, and that's it. But obviously, the garrison surrendered.
Yeah, and for those of our viewers that are watching, to give you a little idea of the geography, I've got a map here that I'm gonna put up. But Josh has got some of his own imagery he's going to end up putting up as he goes through his presentation. You'll note that it looks like kind of like a horseshoe, and it is, because you have Wake at the base of the U and to the southeast. And as you move up towards northwest, you have Peel Island to the north and Wilkes to the south. So you can kind of see the layout. And you'll note that some of the Marine gun positions are annotated on this map if you look closely. I'll have this available probably on our Patreon site for those of you who want to catch up with this map. But I'm going to take it off a share right now and let Josh continue to go, because Wake, you have Pearl Harbor obviously on the 7th. The Wake battle basically kicks off on the 8th.
Yeah. So it's, again, they have a 4-hour window, and mention another great book if anyone gets a chance to read. It's a great firsthand primary source account. A man named Major Walter Baylor was there, and he wrote a book after it called The Last Man Off of Wake. He's the only serviceman to have served at Wake Island, Midway, and Guadalcanal. I don't believe there's any other individual. He was literally the last man off of the island and ended up going through those 3 major battles. So he wrote a terrific book. He tells the story, being at the airfield when the Japanese arrived. And at that time, and to kind of rewind a little bit, Pan American Airways also built a hotel on Peel Island. It's a sort of Y-shaped hotel. Actually, I could bring it up on the screen now. They built the hotel in, I think it was 1935, and it was supposed to originally be a tourist attraction more than anything else. It was a spot where you're having these trans-Pacific flights now taking place, and as time is moving on, really right from the time where America really has Wake in its possession after the events of the Spanish-American War. Fast forward to January 1941. The construction of a submarine and airbase had also begun, again, with the contractors' Pacific Naval Air Bases, again, busily working there. But before this, Pan American has basically at the end of a pier, and I'll show that to you here. If we look at an overhead shot of it, this will be a better one here. You have the Martin M130 flying boat right there, if you see it. The pier that goes out extends from the hotel. So the entire complex, this is an aerial shot of it. The hotel is in the upper part where the Y building is. So this was all on Peel Island. And when the military starts to bring their inventory in there, if you look closely on this photo, it's another angle of Peel. You can closely see the pier and the dock and the flying boat out there. But there's also a number of other planes. Those are PBYs. There's a squadron of them sitting off of the island there, and this is where the Navy base is also going to be situated. So the Navy is there by, again, 1941, and Pan Am also gets the attention of the Japanese. And the Japanese say, okay, Wake is close to us. It's closer to us than it is to the United States. And if they're building bringing in air assets and be able to conduct air operations, then it's a threat, because Wake was really sat at that western edge of America's defenses in the Pacific. So they're seeing all this activity taking place from time Pan Am lands on there, and they're seeing now in 1941 there's patrol plane bases, airfields being constructed. There's all this activity going on there. So it has Japan's attention definitely by the whole year of 1941. Okay, this is Dan Teeters. He's actually the head of the Contractors Pacific Naval Air Bases, and get in charge of around 11 to 1,200 civilian workers, and they were in charge of constructing bunkers, again, revetments, road networks, everything to keep Wake functioning. Wake was not a very big parcel of territory. It sat on top of an extinct volcano, and as you mentioned, the geography of it, it's only about a few feet above sea level. So it was, constantly, subject to harsh weather out there in the middle of the Pacific. So you're dealing with a lot of the elements, and it's hard coral rock you're hard pressed to dig foxholes in those types of conditions.
Yeah.
So they really, in many cases, in many of the raids, Ralph Holowinski, who was with the First Defense Battalion, talked about running out underneath, hiding under the coral ledges that were out on Wake's Reef, and tells a great story about when they were hiding there one time. There were rats under there with them, and one of them was licking the cheese off one of the guy's mustaches as they were hiding there, as the bombs are falling all over the place. So just one great story after another there. So I'll give you a sort of perspective on another major player, and this is Major James Devereaux. Devereaux, as you may have looked at, Joe, was he came in August 1941 and relieved Major Hone, and he stood about 5'5", but he ruled um, pretty harsh, and he had to, because again, he had most of his guys were bigger than him, so he really had, and not to say the Napoleon complex, but he probably did. But Devereaux, is, to his credit, was instrumental throughout the course of the battle. His leadership, not only during the battle, but after the battle, from the time they surrendered and then they were transported to POW camps in Japan and China. He and Paul Putnam and others, all of the officers at Wake, were vital in keeping the POW spirits up, their camaraderie high, the morale high, because obviously, they spent a good, they rode out the entire war from, obviously when they surrendered on December 23rd of 41, they were relieved, most of them in September of 45. Wake was actually retaken in September of 45 as well. So
I think with Devereaux is one of those good case studies when you look at leadership.
Yeah.
Is never a straight line thing.
Yeah.
Like you said, he was a bit of a hard taskmaster early on to keep his guys in line. I mean, they're out there in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
There is no R&R really.
No.
Yeah, there's nothing really to keep the guys occupied. So there's obviously going to be, it guys get into fights when you see the same people over and over again. Things
Yeah.
happen, and you
Exactly.
have to be a disciplinarian.
Yeah.
I thought that, and you'll go over this, I'm sure, but I thought his leadership in the early part of the defense, right up until the surrender, I thought was excellent.
Yeah.
But near the end there, when he decided to basically stay hunkered down, and all the comm lines got destroyed, and he had no
Yep.
way of talking to his forward positions, who were actually having a good showing,
Yeah.
and really inflicting lots of casualties on the Japanese. If he
Yeah.
would have basically come out to get the pulse of his gun positions, he might not have thrown in the towel. I'm not saying Wake wouldn't have fallen, but they
Yeah.
might not have thrown in the towel so early. But
Yeah. The battle
he
might not have ended as quickly as it did.
he recovers to the point where he becomes a key figure during their confinement, where he really shines again.
Yeah, he
So
does.
yeah, again, leadership is never a straight line. There are peaks and
Yeah.
valleys, just like everything in life. And
Exactly. Exactly.
when you have
And
the vagaries of combat and you're stuck in a bunker and you can't see what's going on, sometimes you make the wrong call.
exactly. Yeah.
But
And the main part of of Devereaux's command, and it comes into play after the war. You may have read about a man named Winfield Scott Cunningham, who was the overall commander of the island in superseding Devereaux. And towards the end, I'll kind of get into it towards the end. Um, the two of them, especially after the war, both of them write books, great books. Devereaux writes Story of Wake Island Command by Winfield Scott Cunningham. They sort of play this game where, the Marines get all the credit, and the Navy and Cunningham don't really. They're sort of brushed aside, saying, no, 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 no. The Marines did all the fighting. We did all the killing out here. Navy, no, no, no. We were the ones that were doing the fighting. So there was that sort of drama that played out, and Cunningham pretty much for the rest of his life tried to fight to restore his name in a lot of ways, because there was just this divide between the Marines and the Navy and who got the credit to do what towards the end. So Devereaux, again, interesting stories I should say about him. He's pushing his men, filling sandbags, getting, his sense of urgency was clear, and he knew a lot, I think more than I think a lot of people around him knew. He sensed that something was going to happen, and just pushed his men, pushed them 6-7 days a week, hard labor, and hot sun. You have the tropical climate, and so you in a way it's almost like it reminds you of that, the relationship with Sobel and Easy Company, right? There's just that hatred that exists there, and it brings, in a way, the group closer together, and I think in a lot of ways that's part of what bonds the Wake Island guys together, and especially what keeps them alive in the POW camps is not all of that energy, but a lot of it was us versus him sort of mentality there. So just to get into um, the VMF 211, the Wake Fighter Squadron. And you'll like this, Joe. It's quite possible that the Wildcats, the F4F Wildcats that were used in the defense of Wake Island, were built right here on Bethpage in Long Island, in the Grumman plant.
The Grumman, yeah.
Yeah. So these ones that were sent there were really factory fresh. The paint was still drying on them. The sights weren't on them. The pilots, Putnam included, had really barely flown them. No one had fired the guns. No one had dropped bombs from them. The mechanics who saw these planes come in and scratch their head and say, "What are these things?"
Yeah,
we're used to tooling on Dauntlesses and Brewster Buffaloes, and you're bringing these new fancy Wildcat fighters in here. So the mechanics didn't really have a much familiarity there.
Yeah, the 211 story throughout this fight is like one of the most interesting and amazing aspects of the battle. Just how they kept cannibalizing aircraft after aircraft when they go down to keep the other ones flying. To me, that's one of the best parts of this story. It just shows the ingenuity and what these Marines are having to do throughout the fight just to stay in the fight. So just great stuff.
And just to go go to a little bit more to VMF 211, Paul Putnam is the commanding officer. And when I did my article that came out in World War II Quarterly in 2017, his papers were really the focus of my writing. They were just remarkable. His reports and everything he wrote was just so detailed, right to the finest, just right down to the whatever they were doing. Especially when the POW situation that he's in, he's actually one of about 20 men who are taken off in Japan, while the rest are sent up to camps in China, Wusong. Putnam goes to a camp called Zentsuji. He spends the majority of his time there. He's taken off because he has valuable intelligence, knows about, he's a captain, he's a major at the time, and has been flying and knows about sophisticated technology that the Japanese want to know about. And so Putnam and a number of other flyers from the squadron are taken off that ship that first when they dock in Yokohama. And again, for mostly intelligence, purposes, he's interrogated. The other guy in the picture next to him, Henry Elrod. I don't know if you heard about him. Yeah, Hammer Hank. He was just a fearless aviator, and he became, after Lieutenant Graves, who was killed on the very first day of the battle. A bomb hit his Wildcat as he was sprinting to go out to it. Elrod became Putnam's executive officer and fought. He not only a skilled airman, he shot down 2 Japanese bombers on December 10th, and helps sink the Japanese destroyer Kisaragi on the 11th, after the 1st Defense Battalion sinks the destroyer Hayate with a well-placed 5-inch shell.
Yeah, and, I think those two things really scare the crap out of the Japanese fleet, the commander, because he loses 2 ships early on, and he thinks that the force that's at Wake is much stronger than it is. And I think
they lose a lot of assets, Japanese air and sea. They also lose a submarine on the 10th as well. So they suffer some heavy losses.
And every time they put up the Nels to go and bomb the bomb the island, they're losing. It's a slow war of attrition up there, and they are losing 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, either damaged or shot down on every sortie. And uh, unfortunately, I don't, I've never been able to find any of the Japanese accounts of this to see what their mindset is at the time. But yeah, Hammer and Hank is another one of him and Kinney really are the two
Yeah,
of the backbones of the 211's performance
yeah,
there
and
in my
you
mind.
know, like Kinney, we get into him in a sec. I hold his book in such high regard. Wake Island Pilot. It's just the definitive account of everything that happened there and during the course of the battle, and everything he did was just instrumental to the survival of that squadron right to the last
Yeah.
man. So we're talking about when the Japanese arrive, and I'll get into a little bit more background on that. So they're based in Roy Namor in Kwajalein Atoll. And that's where they have this group called the Chaitos Air Group, the 24th Air Flotilla, is the Nell bombers, the G3M Nell bombers that are sent against Wake. It's in the Marshall Islands. It's about 600 miles to the south. So after that first raid, they take Wake completely by surprise. 4 of the Wildcats are already in the air when the 27 Nells arrive over the airfield, but the rest that are on the ground that are all dispersed in the parking area are just destroyed. 7 of them outright. 3 of Putnam's pilots are killed. Lieutenant Holden, Conderman, and Graves are all killed during that sequence. About 23 of the ground crew are killed. They suffered devastating loss. I think like 60% casualties on that first raid, and um, after that is really the last time the Japanese commit such a daring force that arrives at low level. They almost glide bomb right over the target, and just there's aviation tanks, there's 655-gallon drums filled with fuel, the Wildcats, there's
Yep.
bombs, ammunition. Putnam is actually injured in the shoulder. A couple of other pilots were suffered injuries as well, but they quickly regain themselves. Putnam is almost in like this dazed state, as Baylor in the book tells. He snaps out of it. He's carrying the shattered Springfield around, and just goes into this zone where he leads. Unlike he's probably ever led before in his life. And he's already a combat veteran. He's in Nicaragua flying missions and during the Banana Wars, and so he's already well versed. But Wake sends him to another level. I think seeing his squadron in that state, and the fires and the death and all that around him, it just something comes over him, and he just leads in a way that's just exemplary. It really is. And we'll kind of look at his other aviators underneath them. First guy is John Kinney. They call him Mother of Invention Kinney. His autograph is on this painting behind me, and I'm just proud as hell of it. He was everywhere. He was working on the flying boat engines that he talks about, working on it when it landed at Wake. He did a repair fix. He wanted to check and see if it was okay. Yep, yeah, it's good. This guy had his hands on every kind of plane imaginable. And, during the course of the fight, he's inside of a light-proof hangar with coral rock or on top of him, pounding away at these planes, trying to cannibalize them. What can we salvage? A wheel, a flap, a canopy, whatever the case is. He goes above and beyond, and actually, he literally works himself sick. He's laying in a hospital bed when the Japanese take the island. Putnam tells him, "You got to go to the hospital. You have exhausted yourself mentally and physically, and he cannot possibly do anymore without collapsing and dying at that point." So that's the kind of commitment. And even go further, once Kinney is taken into China as a POW, he escapes. He's one of the few Wake Islanders who actually escapes. He jumps off a train. He actually goes with a group of communists. He has to wear communist hats, uniforms, and another civilian, I forget his name, um, actually meets Mao Zedong at the airport, and Mao gives him Chinese rug, saying, "Thank you, America, for all your help." So interesting interactions coming out of especially McKinney and those guys when they're taking POWs. But Herbert Freuler, the third guy on the top, he's the very last pilot to land an F4F during the battle. He fights. He actually is credited with shooting down the same Kate B52N Kate crew that bombed the Arizona. That was their Boro Kanai was his name. He was the guy credited with sinking the Arizona. Freuler was credited with shooting he and his crew down. So they get a little bit of vengeance for Pearl Harbor there.
Didn't he
So
take some rounds through the his canopy, I
he
think? And
did.
so
Yeah, he was grievously wounded actually and barely made it back to the airfield. He was up with another pilot, the guy in the bottom in the middle, Carl Davidson. Davidson was shot down and would never be seen again. So those were the last two pilots of VMF 211 to fight against the Japanese. So these guys just kept going, and kept going. Like to show you another interesting photo here. This is actually a close up of the airfield. This is taken by one of the PBYs that were stationed there. Now, what you're seeing is a close up of the runway is just running diagonal across the screen. And that dark square, kind of with an angle, that's the actual parking mat where the Wildcats were parked during the battle. And if you'll notice, there's trails that kind of lead up on the right side of it. Those are bulldozers still churning away, still plowing all that coal rock. And this was taken the day before that VMF 211 arrived. So you're getting an idea. This place was still under heavy construction when they arrived, and they were fighting that as much as the Japanese in many ways over the course of the battle.
Isn't there one point that the Pearl radio's back? Can you dredge part of the inlet so we can?
Yes.
And Cunningham's like, are you?
You got to be kidding me.
He like lays out like here's why I can't do this. I mean,
we're in the middle of a siege right now, and you're telling me to go out and
dredge.
Dynamite. They actually had to use dynamite to blow up a lot of the coral heads that grew in the lagoon. Obviously you needed planes landing in there, and you couldn't have them, slamming into these coral growths underneath of that. So I believe it was on the second or third day of the attack, the Japanese actually set off the dynamite cache that's there. Yeah. And from all accounts, is just a deafening explosion takes place there. The damage is done after those first couple of raids. On the 8th, they attack again on the 9th of a much higher altitude. And I'll actually give you, I believe this photograph, it was taken during the battle. This was not taken probably more towards the middle part, maybe the 9th or the 10th, because the raid on the 8th was, low level. They were strafing with machine guns. They were, hitting targets. They could, the wake guys were saying you could see the pilots in their cockpits. And the Japanese, you can see from this formation, were experienced flyers. They were no slouches whatsoever.
Closer than wingtip to wingtip.
Yeah, and in the Americans and a lot of the Marines there, they had just a horrible misunderstanding of the Japanese and didn't expect them to fight this way. How could they? They're not as good as we are. We'll whip them, no problem. And sure enough, these guys are about as professional gets in terms of their airmanship, as we find out at Pearl Harbor and at Wake.
And yet they, despite the fact that they have overwhelming numbers in both what'll eventually be ground forces, naval forces, and air forces, they piecemeal their way into the battle, which really is again mind-numbing to me. But part of it has to do with the fight, I think, that the Marines put up. They just think that the garrison is much stronger than it actually is. But like you said, on the 9th, they come over again, but they're flying at high altitude, but they blow the heck out of the hospital, I think, and they hit one of the main warehouses on Wake.
They, on the second day, they make strikes against, and that's what always leads me to believe that photo I just showed you was they were flying a straight line right over Peel going into Wake, the northern leg of Wake, where the civilian contractors area was, the hospital, all their barracks and everything like that. That area was hit extensively and killed about 55 people in and around that hospital area. So over time, the Japanese will not only send just bombers, they'll also send a lone reconnaissance plane flying way up above, thousands of feet high, out of the range of the guns to get, an overview. Okay, where have we hit? Where are their defense positions? And the garrison's aware of this. And there are times, especially towards the end of the battle, well, they'll literally they were dragging the 3-inch guns and moving them so the Japanese would hit that area. Sure enough, the next day they've moved the guns and saved, another 3-inch gun. And that's the other thing, another point too. They had a number of 3-inch anti-aircraft batteries around dotting the atoll, but there were no crews to fill most of them. They were, so under strength and undermanned that a lot of these batteries were sitting silent and not even, it takes a lot of people to operate a 3-inch and a 5-inch gun.
Yeah, there accounts for there's only 2 Marines manning a gun. I mean, you know how long it takes
Yeah,
to load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire.
yeah,
But I think
it's
really when you start to get near the 10th and the 11th, like you said, they're moving the guns, they're putting dummy guns in some of the positions, they're
yep,
using effective use of camouflage,
yeah,
and this is having an effect. The Japanese are bombing empty positions essentially in some
yeah,
cases, although their bombing is not that accurate a lot.
yeah.
I
It's
mean,
it's really not.
a
They're,
couple of
they're
times
re-
already they're their whole flights are dropping and there's like a stick of bombs going out and maybe one within 150 yards of a
Yeah,
position. I
and
mean that.
a lot of that has to do with VMF 211 and what's left. And as you're seeing in the artwork here, this is depicting Henry Elrod's sortie against, shooting down two of those Nells. So, this sends the Japanese into to a panic because, okay, whoa, they still have fighters up here. This is going to disrupt them. And also the gunners are getting victories on the ground. They are knocking down or damaging a lot of these bombers on every single
Yeah.
mission. So they're getting their hits back and getting up off the canvas, as they say, and starting to hit back rather hard. So going into December 10th into December 11th. And in the middle of the night, uh, lookouts see lights out to sea. The Japanese have sent an invasion force. They're going to attempt an amphibious invasion in the middle of the night. And Devereaux is up on top of his command post. Is these earthen bunkers that are still there, by the way. There's about 3 or 4 of them behind the airfield. He occupies one of them, and alerts his gunners, take your positions. The 5-inch gunners are now tracking the ships as they're forming a line, as you're seeing, as they're preparing to do their gun runs, right? So they're going to go up and kind of slink their way across, seeing how close they can get. And Devereaux notices this, and this is really one of Devereaux's most important command decisions in this battle. He waits. He plays possum. Tells his
Yeah.
gunners, "Don't shoot, don't shoot. Wait till they come in." And a lot of the guys who survived, they did a great documentary in 2002 or three on the History Channel when it showed history, about Wake, and it was about a 2-hour long. It was phenomenal, and the gunners there say they were probably within 4,500 yards, and which is awfully close.
Yeah.
And Devereaux says, "Okay, we're waiting," and there's guys on the radio saying, "Is this guy trying to get us killed? What does he think he is?" I mean, these guys are probably cursing him up and down over the radio. Then he gives the order to open fire, and they score hit after hit after hit, including the sinking of the Hayate by Battery L off of Wilkes, and they literally send a round right in the middle, cuts the ship in half. It blows the magazine up, and that's they were cheering and screaming, and the gun captains are saying, "Knock it off! This is not a ball game. Get
Yeah.
serious.
Yeah.
We're still fighting here, guys."
Yeah, they
And
even early on they bracket the Yabari, which is the flagship, and then they finally start
yes,
scoring hits on it, and then
yeah,
they have to bring in I think it was a cruiser or another destroyer that kind of shepherd it out, lay down a smoke screen, and this is where
yep.
Hammer and Hank destroys the Kisaragi,
Yeah,
and
so if you notice on this map, just to the extreme right, where it says Kisaragi bombed and sunk 30 miles southwest of Wake around 7:31.
yeah.
So when the attack begins, Putnam and his aviators, they have maybe 3 or 4 planes left. They all go up in the air, and we're not going to get caught on the ground again. And sure enough, it pays off. And they only have 100-pound bombs. These are not big pieces of ordnance wherever
No,
to
not at
drop on
all.
bombs. And they said, "Are we going to be able to do this?" And we're just going to keep trying and see what happens. And sure enough, Elrod comes in on the Kisaragi and drops a bomb. And what Paul Putnam sees it and says he saw the bomb go in, and it was kind of, they were already, hits from their 50 caliber machine guns, and they had already strafed that ship and a number of others. And it set off a number, either a torpedo or a depth charge, and it just set off a chain reaction and sunk the ship.
Yeah, I think
So
it said
this,
the official Marine Corps history, I think, said it hit a depth charge magazine, and that,
yes,
yeah, it tore it apart.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
and the other funny thing is, we're talking about this is really probably the height of the Marine Corps action in terms of doing damage to the Japanese. But what really it does is it buys them a few days of time, because outside of some flying boat attacks,
yeah,
we don't see the Nells for a handful of days, right? 4 or 5 days
exactly,
before the Nells show
yeah,
back up. And they're able to reinforce their positions. They're able to redig new
yep,
ones. And again, this is a credit to those Marines, making do with what they have: reduced gun crews, reduced
yep,
flight crews, and they inflict serious losses on this Japanese task force, to the
yeah,
point where
and
they have to recall some of the Pearl Harbor strike group.
yes,
Right?
correct,
Yeah,
yep. And
amazing
you
stuff.
mentioned the flying boats, and they do send them these large H6K Mavis flying boats that are, come in at. They used to fly them in at night, so they're more for kind of an annoyance, kind of a psychological kind of thing, more than a terror. They don't really know. They drop their bombs. They miss usually every time, but you hear probably one of those things coming in the middle of the night, and explosions. That's going to get your attention. You're gonna go up, and it's going to rattle you a little bit. So the Japanese, are again continuing their aerial attacks after, the amphibious invasion is thwarted. And to my knowledge, the only time in World War II where an amphibious invasion is stopped, if I am
Yeah,
correct to say that, I believe that is the case. And it's, again, that distinction belongs to the Wake Islanders. So it's a remarkable time. Giving morale. The guy. This is not only boosting the morale of the Wake Islanders, but now America is starting to pay attention as they're going to movies and seeing these newsreels, and they're
yeah,
seeing newspapers. Wake, is standing strong, and it was almost like a
and the
rallying
cartoons too.
point. Exactly. Yeah. There was
That
just,
famous cartoon, I think you have it in your slide deck there.
yeah.
It is very well known.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, it's given when America finally finds out about it. That's the key,
Exactly.
right? I mean, at times it takes quite a while for the information to actually filter out to the general public.
Yeah. Much different time period. We're not obviously talking about, the internet, or, any kind of information you can get, at the press of a button in the palm of your hand. News definitely traveled much slower back during those times. So when we talk about the Wake Relief Mission, now, Husband Kimmel is at Pearl Harbor. His fleet has been, just, ravaged before his eyes. The famous story of the Japanese round coming through and hitting him in the chest, and says it would have been merciful if it would have killed me. And he is still reeling. So the Wake Relief Mission is his baby. He authorizes it. It is a mission to send Wake's reinforcements to Wake, the 4th Defense Battalion, VMF 221. So they're going to be bringing supplies. They're going to evacuate the civilians off the island. This is going to be the relief mission that we're just going to, in spite of Japanese submarines or any surface ships that might be out there in the Pacific between us and Wake Island, this is what we're going to do. We're going to send, a task force out there, throw another one to try and deflect Japanese attention off the initial force. And this is a whole plan that he draws up. But Wake now falls into someone else's hands, and that's William S. Pye. Um, Kimmel is fired. And from the time that he is fired until Chester Nimitz takes over command, Pye is going to be running the show. And he's a bit gun shy about the Wake Relief Mission. He's not sure whether he should commit to it. It's already underway when he takes over. And this photograph right here is the elements of the 4th Defense Battalion boarding the USS Tangier.
Yep.
This is going to be the main ship that is going to be a part of this task force to go out and again break the siege and take the fight, hopefully back to the Japanese. But in many respects, this was a huge gamble. We just saw what happened at Pearl Harbor. Could there be another Pearl Harbor in the middle of the Pacific where we're not going to be able to salvage and raise all the ships after the fact and minimize the damage? So there's that risk that's there as well. So just to give you the some of the ships involved in this relief mission, the Tangier, which is at Pearl Harbor, the Lexington, which was delivering fighters to Midway when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Thankfully, it is not important when the Japanese attacked. Neither is the Enterprise. The Enterprise was actually the carrier that delivered the fighters to Wake Island. They are on their way back. Some of their scout planes go ahead of the carrier and get caught up in the attack. Enterprise, due to a delay, was actually going to be in port during the attack, but thankfully it was delayed and did not arrive until later on that evening. The USS Saratoga is also involved in Task Force 8. So you're really putting all of your chips onto the table here with this relief mission, because if this goes wrong and you're gonna lose all of these naval assets in the middle of the Pacific,
especially the carriers.
This is Pearl Harbor Part 2, the even worse sequel.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, especially the carriers. I mean, they're vital right now to maintaining any kind of combat power in the Pacific. And weren't they fighting the weather too? It took a while for the Tangier to load, and then they were fighting the weather coming out.
There was a weather delay. There's refueling delays. There was all sorts of things that were acting against the force. And what eventually would turn the task force around was the message that was coded by Commander Cunningham: "Enemy on island, issue in doubt." And before that, there was another and more, I would say, infamous one that, in terms of Morse coding, there's a lot sort of lost in the conversation. What you're trying to say is one thing, what is read out and interpreted on the other end could be completely something different. So the message was, send us reinforcements, more Japanese are coming. But it came out as send us more jets. So it makes it seem, and that just got everyone, look at this, with the Wake Islanders they're
Look
still
what they're
confident,
doing. They're fighting.
It sent the wrong message entirely.
Yeah, it makes you think that they can hold out. A bit longer. And you also had the possibility that force right there that you have up on the screen could have barreled into the Pearl Harbor strike group as well.
Exactly.
And who knows, that would have been a crapshoot at that point.
Yeah. And that was the thing too, and that was another part of the reasoning of them pulling the task force and turning around, bringing it back to Pearl, was by December 21st to 22nd, and on the 23rd, there were Japanese fighters now attacking Wake Island. It wasn't just the Nels and the Mavis flying boats. It was now Kates, Vals, Zeros, the same ones that had just struck Pearl Harbor. Two of the carriers from the task force, as you mentioned, were split off from the main force heading back to Japan to try and sort of relieve the siege again, and try and break the garrison there with more, to try and soften up the defense positions there. So the fighters start attacking and bombing the island significantly, and this tells the commanders, in Hawaii and again in Washington, okay, the carriers are around. This is only a matter of time to the island's going to fall here, and we cannot possibly take a risk of losing all of these ships. This could push us all the way back to the West Coast, just like the Japanese had intended to in the first place by attacking Pearl Harbor. Luckily enough, they had missed the carriers, and they were able to refloat most of the ships that were sunk. But again, more attacks are continuing from the point where they defeated the Japanese on the 11th. The Nels are bombing day after day, and as we're getting towards December 20th, Major Baylor in his the famous Last Man Off Wake Island story happens. He's the radio and communications officer for MAG 21. He is responsible for setting up air-to-ground communications between the the communications tent and the aviators themselves. So Baylor gets on a PBY that lands during the battle and leaves the next day. His orders are done at Wake. He has orders to go to Midway and continue on there. So he's literally the guy who's taking every last letter, every last report, every last piece of correspondence with him on the plane. And again, he is not only the last man off Wake Island, he's also the first man back in 1945. Ceremoniously, that's a Japanese officer saluting him there as he's getting off the dock and setting foot back on Wake Island. He is the last and first American officer, actual fighting Marine. That's not to say there are not Americans still on the island after Wake falls. There are. And that's a story that it does not have a very good ending. So when the Japanese kind of fast forward a little bit, when the garrison surrenders, they are herded aboard the Nidamaru, which is a converted Japanese transport, and they take the bulk of the Americans and the contractors off the island. There are a number of Americans still on the island, a number of men who are still too wounded to be moved, and a number of contractors that will be whittled down to eventually 98. And in October of 1943, from about February of 1942, towards the end of the war, the Americans are attacking Wake from the air and the sea. Naval guns. There's famous pictures of the Dauntlesses flying over Wake and bombing. B-24 missions are pretty common over Wake during the entire course of the war. So the Japanese do not have a very good time. The garrison that's on Wake, they're cut off by submarines. The Americans basically, quarantine the island basically. And any ships that try to get in, they'll sink, and many of them are. The 98 contractors are kept there to build the revetments, bunkers, pillboxes, these types of things for the Japanese. They actually were forced labor technically. And then after a raid on October 5th, 6th, and 7th, particularly a heavy raid, the Japanese commander Shigemura Sakabara is the one who gives the order to have all of the 98 civilians executed. They're just taken out and machine gunned, buried. And I believe the story goes they found one that they was one short, and they found him and they killed him, something to that effect. But there is a rock called the 98 Rock, if you've seen it, that they said that the civilians carved it into the rock, saying 98 US POW 51043. So that was the reminder. That was the 98 that were there. One of them was actually from Patchogue. Paul Muller. Yeah, one of the unfortunate ones that were executed was a guy from Long Island. Yeah, so
the
sad end to that story.
Eventually hung for those crimes.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Well,
so
the assault on Wake and the taking of Wake is just one part of the story. Obviously, it's the POW. The captivity that these guys have to endure is as most people who follow World War II history know, the Japanese were particularly brutal with their POWs, and this was no different. This situation, with these men.
And towards get towards the end of the battle itself, when we get to the POWs, the Japanese will send an even bigger task force to the island on the 23rd in the early morning hours of December. And the Americans are there waiting for them. Again, they have 30, 50 caliber machine guns on the island. They have one of the 3-inch guns repurposed as an anti-boat gun. The Japanese will run aground 2 destroyer transports, patrol boats 32 and 33. They will actually be sitting on Wake's Reef for years after World War II is over, and eventually will fall off into the sea. But they run them aground, and the Americans are running out there, lobbing hand grenades into them. I mean,
Yep.
the combat is close quarter, hand to hand, bayonets, and the Japanese are sending wave after wave, and the Americans are just mowing them down. I mean, like you said, in the early first few hours of the battle, the Americans inflict heavy casualties on the
They're
Japanese.
definitely holding their own. And Marine
Yeah.
positions, it's not just the 30 calibers. They had BARs and Thompsons as well as their
Yes.
Springfields. They had a
Yep.
plethora of automatic weapons, and they definitely had
Yes.
fire superiority in a lot of these positions. And this is why, to me, it's so shocking what ends up happening. They are literally stopping the Japanese at the water's edge.
Yeah. And another good point of reference is in this actual painting. You'll notice the Japanese soldier with the flag tied to his rifle. That was common during amphibious assaults. The Japanese, what they would do as a tactic would be placing flags on the beach as to show the ships offshore friendlies are in this particular area, don't fire on this particular sector. So the Japanese do that. Once they get on, they begin to cut the communication wires that they see everywhere that's around the ground. They're doing what they have to do, to cut off communication. They're also, it has an unintended effect. Devereaux sees the flags and says, "Oh man, we're done. It's over. I can't speak to any of my positions. I'm seeing the flags all over the place." So that is actually another contributing factor in what influences Devereaux's decision making in terms of surrendering.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate mistake, um, in that he doesn't know Japanese tactics, he doesn't understand them, and if he had been able to, if the communication wires hadn't been severed by Japanese shelling, he would have been able to talk to his gun positions, and they could have given
Yeah,
him the ground truth and explain to him, "Hey, sir, no, we got them. We're holding our own, or we need resupply, or I won't be able to hold my own." But either way, without that vital communications, and
yeah,
his inability to travel to his forward positions really kind of dooms the garrison at that point.
yeah. So, and we get to the point now in the battle to talk about Henry Elrod. He is fighting on the ground with the elements that remain of VMF 211. They have at this point, after they've exhausted the last Wildcat, Putnam and his men fall in with the rest of the First Defense Battalion, and Putnam and the civilians don't really. Putnam kind of looks down on them a little bit, and he gets into an argument with a bunch of contractors that were out, placing rods and things like that laboriously. He's like, "No, we need to do away with all the engineering fancy stuff. We need to get, you know, graders out here and bulldozers and just get it on with." So the civilians were following Putnam at one point, saying, "You can't shake us, Mr. Putnam. You can't make us go away." And he reluctantly says, "Okay, you guys you guys load ammo, you guys do this and that." So the civilians and the Marines are now together fighting the Japanese as they're invading the island, and it's becoming more and more apparent that the Japanese are simply not going to go away until they take the island. That's exactly what happens in the early morning hours of December 23rd, 1941. This particular sketch is what it looked like. The Japanese stripped everyone down. I mean, everyone, no clothing, right down to the last stitch of clothing, and herded them out to the airfield so they can keep a good eye on everyone there, civilian and military alike. So it is sweltering hot during the day, and for 3 straight days, including Christmas of 1941, the Marines are out there and the civilians are out there just sweltering and baking in the sun. It's freezing cold at night. It rains at one point. You have the tropical rains that occur, of course, all the time. So the weather, and the Japanese, are doing this to them just to sort of break them psychologically and see,
Yeah.
get them under new control. And eventually on January 12th, 1941, most of the garrison and the civilians are brought into the Nidamaru, as I mentioned earlier. The picture at the bottom, that is Commander Cunningham on the right, and that is Superintendent Dan Teeters of the civilian contractors on the left. So They are taken aboard, and the Japanese have a newsreel footage of Cunningham and the civilians, and they make a newsreel statement to the Americans, say that we have the wake has fallen, the garrison surrendered, and we are being well treated and well respected by the Japanese, which was not the
No.
case whatsoever. The trip from Wake to Japan was terrible because it was January, it's winter, and these guys have been out toiling in the tropical sun. So all of a sudden, the steel hull of that ship gets mighty cold,
Yeah.
and the temperature drop must have been quite shocking for these guys. And another thing that takes place on the ship as well, most of them are put in the hull. The officers, about 30 of them, are in the mail room, and the Japanese are bringing them all in and just beating them as they're coming onto the ship, slapping them. Major Devereaux gets slapped in the face at one point. So they're trying to just beat them physically and mentally. And most of the civilians and the garrison are in the hull of the ship, in the front, the bow. And there was about maybe 1 or 2 buckets for the entire group for a latrine. And the Japanese will go down there and they'll make a guy stand up, hang up on the bar and just beat him over and over again. So they were being brutalized, and they were getting a good idea of what life was going to be like over the next couple of years. And another significant event that happens, there are 5 Marines, actually, I think 3 Marines and 2 Navy personnel that are ordered up on the ship on top of the deck, and they're never seen again. The Japanese behead 5 of them because they have ties to the aviation squadron. They, samurai sword, and they throw their bodies overboard. And again, that's another, again, one of quite a few atrocities that are committed by the Japanese. But the POWs, for the most part, I would say, and again, this photo is terrific because this is a rare photo and it shows a good core of the garrison. Major Devereaux is on the extreme right, sitting with the mustache. Above him in the back is John Kinney. Uh, Herbert Frother, the last pilot of VMF-211 who was wounded, is with the scarf next to the radio with the mustache. Arthur Poindexter's there. Woodrow Kessler, Dr. Kahn. These were all, key players in the battle. Officers who, directed, the men and made these, it was gut wrenching and many times courageous decisions all throughout the battle. So the POW experience, again, for the Wake Islanders, they actually enjoy one of the highest survival rates of all POWs, especially in Japan in World War II, because as you mentioned, the Americans were not well treated by the Japanese at all. It's not like Germany where you get at least some somewhat humane treatment. The Japanese look upon surrender as as a disgrace. They look down upon the Americans. You guys should have fought to the last man. And there's that samurai bushido code that the Japanese adhere to, so they would treat the Wake Islanders with even more contempt as a result of that.
Well, I'd say this has been a fantastic presentation on Wake. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers are learning more and more, and I'm hoping that they'll take an increased interest in reading about these guys. Like you said, there's plenty of books out there. Some of them are better than others. My friend Tony
Yeah.
Coulter, got to give a shout out to Big Tony out of Philly. The Siege of Wake Island, Facing Fearful Odds by Gregory Irwin. That's his personal recommendation. I know that you have your favorites. Out there it is.
I still have like multiple bookmarks from when I was doing my research. I don't think I ever took them out. This is the book to read as far as Wake Island. He also wrote a book called Victory in Defeat, which talks about the POWs, which is again phenomenal. So Dr. Irwin, he's a friend of mine. We talk pretty often about Wake and stuff like that. So he's the authority on the subject, and he's been to Wake a number of times. And all the interviews he did, he just knocked it out of the park, and that's really the high mark for that. So yeah, definitely that book. John Kinney's book, Wake Island Pilot, is great. Devereaux's book is great. And it was a World War II quarterly in the spring of 2017. Yours truly.
There you go. I will we'll make sure that we get web
Not to
pages.
shamelessly plug myself or anything like
No,
that.
no, not at all. You're more than welcome to shamelessly plug. Um, I will make sure we get all the links for these posted up when the video goes live.
Awesome.
And that way everybody who wants to do some more digging and um, we'll also, if you're willing, we'll put your contact info out if anybody's got any
Yeah.
questions they want to send to you. Obviously, I mean, Josh is a professor, so he loves to teach, and he'll make sure you know he'll get you what you need in terms of info, or at least point you in the right direction. I mean, that's really what we're trying to do, is not only just have a good time and talk about these heroes from World War II, but also educate folks and keep illuminating some of these lesser known fights. Although Wake was very well known, like we
Yeah.
talked about in the onset of the pod, it was kind of lost in the sauce, so to speak, with Pearl happening on the 7th and the battle for Wake kicking off on the 8th.
Yep.
And people really don't think about it because, like you said, there's Midway and Guadalcanal. These are really the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. All of
Yep.
these events that in the Pacific Theater that happen, you know, um, tend to overshadow Wake as a story. But as you read, as I spent many hours of the last couple of weeks after we locked in about doing the show,
Yeah.
some of the personalities involved and the things that were done to fortify the island and just watching how actions influence other actions,
Yeah.
both good and bad, um, it's pretty amazing drama. And obviously someone in Hollywood thought so as well.
Yeah. You know what was interesting? I always wonder if they're ever going to do like a modern film or series. I think Wake would be a great series, not a film, but like a Band of Brothers Pacific Masters of the Air type thing, like a 9 or 10 part series, because you can fit just all those 2 weeks, day by day. You can definitely, there's so much there, material wise, character wise. What I think, what I've heard from a lot of families and a lot of relatives I've spoken to, Wake is a painful reminder for a lot of the people who were there, because they had no idea where their loved one was at any given time. They didn't hear from most of them until they were already in POW camps. They had no correspondence from that time of the attack until, again, obviously coming home, 3.5 years later. It was hard for a lot of families, and obviously what they went through, not of course during the battle, but the POW experience for a lot of people. If they say, and Putnam talks about it too, how if you were in those camps and you were simply a person who was just too shocked and overwhelmed, you would just sort of cower in the corner and be left alone and wouldn't want anyone to go in. Those are the ones that would die first. The ones that
Yep.
were most despondent, but the ones that were, Putnam talks about, you know, putting together like sugar packets for someone's birthday, you know,
Yeah.
and coming up with, everyone pooling their money to buy something for someone else. You really find out about how the Marines just they bonded together in these terrible circumstances, and everything was beyond their control, but still. And Devereaux talks about it too. He would often say, mind yourselves, you're still Marines. That was
Yeah.
one of his quotes when his men were, especially when he had to give the order to surrender. He had to walk with the Japanese rifleman next to him with a surrender flag. He had to go foxhole to foxhole to every position and say, throw down your weapons, we're surrendering. And the guy, and most of them couldn't believe it. They're like,
No.
we're surrendering? No, Marines don't
This
surrender.
is not what we do.
So that had to be tough. And we
Yeah.
talked about the leadership part, how Cunningham and Devereaux had this sort of exchange in the years following World War II, who gets credit for the defending Wake and everything that happens that way. So that's kind of the one narrative that is the most visible from the Wake Island experiences after the war. Is the Cunningham Devereaux controversy, as they call it. So
Yeah. I think you put a bow on it.
Awesome.
I want to thank all of our viewers for checking in. If you are if you're so inclined, we're on Patreon. $3 a month gets you all kinds of extra stuff, plus obviously access to all of our videos and pods. You can find us on YouTube. If you do, hit like and subscribe, please. We're also on Spotify and Apple and Amazon. You can find us on almost any podcatcher out there. I want to thank everybody for listening and watching. And Josh, thanks for coming on and
Thank
putting
you.
on an outstanding presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure all of our viewers did as well.
It's my pleasure. I always look forward to talking about Wake, and it's something I'm still passionate about. I've been writing and researching Wake for so many years now. It took up so much of my time for so many years, and I think, wow, I look at my hard drive and all the stuff I collected, all the documents and photographs and a lot of rare stuff, and Wake is almost became a part of me in a lot of ways, and I think that's one of the things that I pride myself on is connecting with the relatives of the families. I connected with Paul Putnam's family, with Dave Pearsall's family. I actually contributed to a book he wrote about his father called Son of Wake Island. So still immersed in Wake. I always will be in some way, shape, or form. It's a remarkable story of courage, perseverance, heroism, any adjective you want to throw in there. It's where America picked itself up after Pearl Harbor and said, okay, we're going to start the war with these guys. And we're going to, if a garrison of 449 Marines can do this to a Japanese, landing force, World War II is a piece of cake. I mean, not a piece of cake, but saying once we get up, mobilized, industrialized, no one's going to stop us, right?
Yeah. Well, your passion for the topic definitely comes through. Thanks again.
Of course. Thank you, John. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks everybody for checking in.